Forward. Thank you.
Thank you.
So we have now our next talk is split into two. It's by R Shankar Raman and Akshay Surendra. They're going to share this session, and they're going to speak about 2 decades apart monitoring rainforest birds in Mizoram and the Anamalais, which is in the Western Ghats. So if you can play their talk, and then they'll come online later for discussion. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Shankar Raman. I'm a scientist with the Nature Conservation Foundation, making this presentation along with Akshay Surendra, who's a PhD student at Yale University. This talk will give an account of our monitoring of rainforest birds in two very different regions in India, in Mizoram state in northeast India and in the Anamalais Hills. We thank the organizers of the symposium for the opportunity to make this presentation. Before we begin, we can ask the question, why should we monitor birds in the long term? And one of the obvious reasons is that very often what we are trying to understand about how birds change take a very long time to show. They may take years or decades to show how birds respond to aspects such as the restoration of forests, how they respond to agriculture in the landscape, or what happens to bird communities when habitats are fragmented. So besides these long-term changes, there could also be changes that occur because of global drivers. And we know today that the entire planet is facing a climate crisis, and we may want to know how birds are affected by such changes. So by monitoring birds in the long term, we get a lot of information on bird communities, and this data has value in terms of adding new scientific knowledge about the species or populations, as well as the places that we study. It can also give us insights into conservation, where we are able to make better assessments of the threats and population trends of species, which can then feed into conservation strategy and policy. We can also use the information gathered from long-term monitoring to evaluate whether our conservation interventions work. So when we protect a species or when we are trying to restore a habitat, by tracking bird populations, we can actually assess to see whether our work is effective in the long run. Now, our work in Mizoram focused on how bird communities recover with shifting agriculture and forest recovery. This was done in Dampa Tiger Reserve, where I first went to study birds in 1994-95, and then I returned 19 years later in 2014 to recensus the exact same transects, the same places that I had walked 19 years ago. The landscape includes a mosaic of fields as well as regenerating bamboo and secondary forests, as well as intact mature forests that are part of the Dampa Tiger Reserve. So within each of these sites, I walked transects to survey for birds early in the mornings, and also surveyed vegetation using standard methods. And I was able to go back to the same transects 19 years later and walk them looking at birds to see how the habitat had changed, as well as the bird communities had changed in these sites. The kind of habitats that I covered in this study varied a lot. So there were recently cultivated fields that were just 1 year since they had been abandoned, where they were more open. There was a range of sites that had recovered for various lengths of time, and they were bamboo and secondary forests that were regenerating, and then there were also mature forests that had never been cut. This kind of study is called a space for time substitution study. Obviously I couldn't wait in one place for 100 years to monitor the changes, so I just looked at sites that had recovered for different lengths of time in order to study this. But by going back 19 years later, I could also see what had actually happened to these sites after a span of time. So when we look at the way the bird communities change, it changes a lot as you go from these open fallows to the mature forests, as you can imagine, from birds like bulbuls and dark grey bush chats and the more open fallows, through birds that are found in secondary forests, to some species that are found only in the mature and evergreen forests. And what I found in my earlier work, which you can see here indicated in the blue dots, is that as the forests recover, the number of bird species that you get along these transects also recovers. And I had predicted, and one would expect that if you went back to these sites and they had recovered over 19 years, that most of these blue dots would move upwards and to the right, as they aged and they added birds, and that is more or less what we find here. Although the number of birds or the number of bird species per transect actually increased a little more than I had predicted at that time. So that was an interesting aspect. In addition, we also found that there was an interesting trend related to the bamboo that you find in these forests. So as the forest recovers, bamboo increases in density, but every 50 years the bamboo flowers en masse and dies out. And I had predicted from my space for time substitution study back then that after the bamboo dies out, the rainforest would come back, and the vegetation would be dominated by evergreen plants and similarly rainforest birds. But what I actually found when I went back 19 years later was that the bamboo persisted. Despite flowering and dying, there had been a lot of regeneration of bamboo, and in fact in some places the density of bamboo had increased as compared to the past. By going back in 2014, another thing that we found was that the landscape around Dampa Tiger Reserve had changed. The government had promoted oil palm cultivation, and so there was a large area of oil palm that was being planted, and so we were able to do a quick study looking at the effects of oil palm cultivation, and we found, for instance, that oil palm was a much more harmful practice of land use, having much fewer birds than the Jhum landscape itself in northeastern India. In the Anamalais, our work was very different. Our work focused on looking at rainforest fragmentation and restoration in the Valparai Plateau and Anamalai Tiger Reserve, and the surveys carried out here were episodic, mostly between 2000 and 2005, and then again in 2019-20. So here we used point count methods, where we went into different forest patches of varying sizes, and they were all 5-minute point counts surveyed. And we returned to these sites many years later to ask these questions. Has the bird abundance changed? Has it stayed the same? Are there more species or fewer? And have there been changes in the kinds of bird species that one finds in these sites? That is, changes in species composition. So the bird density over time, we found, had stayed the same only for the open country birds, whereas rainforest birds and the more restricted range endemic birds had actually declined. And you can see that while our study estimated a decline locally, this sort of mirrored the patterns found region-wide in the State of India's Birds report, where endemic bird species showed fairly sharp declines in their populations. The number of species, however, more or less stayed the same or increased a bit in these sites. So while there had been no change or actually a slight increase in the number of bird species, their populations had been coming down. And there was also a change in the kinds of species in the community. So when we looked at the composition, we found that when a particular site was compared to itself in terms of its bird community composition, we found that there was much greater change in the smaller patches and much smaller change in the larger patches in the landscape. So in a sense, the bird communities in larger patches of forest tended to be more stable. So to quickly summarize these findings, what our long-term monitoring revealed is that space for time substitution can reveal some broad patterns, but by actually going to these same sites for long-term monitoring, you can find surprising trends or find new changes in the landscape as well. The bird communities in mature rainforests are not just more diverse, but they are also more stable. And we have some worrying declines detected in the rainforest bird densities in the Western Ghats. A related study found that Malabar grey hornbill densities, an endemic species, had also declined in this region, and the species was recently uplisted as a consequence to vulnerable in the IUCN Red List. What is also interesting from these studies is that a large number of bird species persist in these secondary forests and in these habitat fragments. They are still there 19 years later. And so it suggests that these habitats are not marginal habitats where the species are just declining, but they act as a very important buffer around these landscapes, and we need to consider those areas for conservation when we think long term for bird conservation in the region. I'd like to conclude this talk by thanking a large number of people and agencies that have helped our work over these years, and the organizers for this opportunity to present to you. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Shankar and Akshay. If you are both there, Akshay is both of them are here. Yeah. Okay. So let me just head to the Slack window and see. All right. We have one question so far by Pratik. It's a bit of a complicated question. What would you estimate is the temporal scale of community change? In other words, what's the minimum period between surveys to detect changes in the bird community? And might that vary by family?
Thank you for that question. I think the temporal scale of community change depends on the kind of habitat change that you're talking about. In most cases, in fragmentation studies and forest recovery studies, what we find is that there is a lot of change in the initial years following the intervention. Immediately after fragmentation or immediately after a habitat is converted and when it's beginning to recover. So if you wanted to track the change, it would be nice to actually have uh, your sampling at pretty close intervals, at least on an annual basis in the initial years, and then maybe spacing it out over a period of a few years as time increases. That might be a compromise if you're not able to sample continuously, every year.
That's good. Akshay, did you want to add anything?
No, I think, the other question was about variation with families, and
Yes.
I think we did find a lot of species and family-specific trends. There's a lot of data that hopefully in the next few months and years we can explore that further.
Yeah, thank you. Again, apologies those who are typing questions. I have to choose a few of them since we don't have that much time. One question: what could Roosbe asked this question? What could account for the increase in number of species in the Anamalais study?
We don't know. I think it's possibly because many of the sites are getting a few additional open country birds coming in, because of the effects of edge and the surrounding matrix. But we don't really know why that has changed. Some of the sites are also being protected in the long run. So there has been no change in the fragment size. And we've also been running a long-term rainforest restoration program in some of the fragments. So it is possible that the long-term protection as well as the restoration of habitat has contributed to increase in the number of species that we're recording in some sites.
Okay, but then in counterpoint to that is a decrease in abundance of
decrease in abundance.
Yes,
Yeah,
yes.
which,
Okay.
We don't understand why it's happening.
Yeah, and that could be because of larger landscape effects, larger than you're capturing. But anyway, obviously, lots of remaining questions. So there's a question by Ashwin about clear winners and losers in Mizoram. I'm afraid if you could ask that question, answer that, sorry, over Slack, that'd be great because we're a bit over time. Is that okay? Shankar, yeah, Akshay. Great. Thank you both for joining us. Please interact lots over Slack. Most of the interesting stuff will be happening via text message on Slack. Okay, and there's lots of good back and forth. Right now, we can only ask one question. You can give one response, so there can't be a back and forth. But Slack enables that through the text messaging. So thank you both, and looking forward to further discussions on this.
Thank you.